Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Malkin Fund, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. And last year, when my guest Eric Wanner, the learned social psychologist who heads the Russell Sage Foundation, joined me here to mark its centennial, 100 years now devoted to strengthening the methods, data, and theoretical core of the social sciences, we discussed the why of the matter, social science for what? And in essence, Dr. Wanner's answer was so that in our democracy, political decisions could be better informed, so that we might vote more wisely, picking leaders whose policies realistically reflect tough as nails, on-the-ground reality, rather than simply ancient but deceptive and perhaps dangerous prejudice. Well, immigration is surely just such a divisive issue in the 2008 presidential political race. And as we might expect, it's a field in which the Russell Sage Foundation has published several important research volumes. Among them, Beyond Smoke and Mirrors, Mexican Immigration in an Era of Economic Integration, A Nation by Design, Immigration Policy in the Fashioning of America, and Immigrants and Boomers, Forging a New Social Contract for the Future of America. And I would begin today by asking my guest, in the most general way, whether and how he believes these research efforts do give us a more systematic, reliable kind of social knowledge, getting at underlying causes, things we can't necessarily see on the surface, but are nevertheless going on underneath what we can see. And that's part of the definition of social science research Dr. Wanner offered last year. And I would ask him today if these research volumes do indeed help us deal now with the politics of immigration in this presidential election year. Again, a big, big question, Eric.
I'm not sure they help us deal with the politics of immigration, but I think they might inform us about immigration policy, which the best immigration policy, and how to improve on what we have now. And that's by no means an obvious problem. One thing I'd pick up to start with, and the danger here is that I'm going to give long speeches, and you have to interrupt me. I know you're good at that, but there's no quick answer, but there are stories. So here is a story. The question about immigration over the Mexican border and what we should do about it. Estimates are now that the flow is on the order of 1 million a year, undocumented immigrants, and that quite surprisingly, the efforts to harden the border after the Immigration Control and Reform Act of 1986 actually seemed to have increased the undocumented population in the U.S. And that's something that comes out of a study that we've helped support, although it was largely supported by the National Institutes of Health, which is a 20-year study of the flow of immigrants from small Mexican communities in southwestern Mexican states to the U.S., involving interviews with household heads in those Mexican communities and also interviews with the immigrant households largely in Chicago. To try to get a sense of what the flow was like. And when you do that, I think you get some of the systematic knowledge you were talking about that changes your understanding of what immigration from Mexico is all about. So what you find is that immigration was, before 1986, largely a circular affair. That is, migrant workers came here, they stayed a while, they sent money back home. The money had an enormous effect in terms of improving the quality of life of the families back in Mexico. And then after working here for a while, they went back because they'd much rather live with their families in Mexico than they would in the United States, which after all for them is an alien culture and so forth.
And now?
And now, so we harden the border, okay? So what happens when you harden the border? Well, it makes it more difficult and expensive and dangerous to cross the border. So what happens is, once you get to this side, you tend to stay here. So this study, for example, I've got some numbers in my head. I brought you some numbers. Before the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the probability of going back in any one year was about 25%. After the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, the probability of going back after about 4 or 5 years after the act had dropped to about 10%. And the average length of stay here had gone from 3 years to 8 years or 9 years. And furthermore, you're not here for 9 years without putting down some roots and starting a family. Women increasingly came across the border. Families on this side started to form and stay. And you got a much more permanent kind of immigration by means of, because you'd hardened the border and made it more expensive. It now costs $3,000 to hire a coyote to come to bring you across, and dangerous. The rate of death and injury in crossing the border increased. And so what you got was a much more permanent settlement of undocumented Mexicans in the U.S., now estimated to be something like, I think it's something like 12 million people.
Now,
so that's systematic social knowledge that you couldn't have gotten without this kind of a survey that looks on immigration histories across the border. And it really tells you that your policy, which was supposed to reduce immigration, actually had a perverse unintended consequence.
but you know, there's something very interesting that you said before you offered this information, and that is that and it was cynical, which is all right at this table, but it was, and that is that in a sense we have here social science research information, but you didn't know that it would have much to do with the politics of the matter or the policy of the matter. But shouldn't this, wouldn't one assume that this would then be at the base of what our policy is?
Okay, in my world, I separate policy and politics. That's probably naive on my part, but I would think policy, the question is sort of what do you want to attain? What relationship do we want to have? And this is really very important. Remember the last time we talked, I said, you have to begin by saying what goals are you trying to achieve socially? And then you can think about designing institutions to try to achieve those goals, and then you can see what are the consequences of those institutions. And so the story I just told you is we wanted to reduce the flow of undocumented workers from Mexico. We hardened the border, and that had the perverse consequence of making it more difficult to go back, and therefore you got a more permanent undocumented group in the U.S. Right?
Well,
so then the question is, all right, so what should our policy be if we want to achieve that goal? That is, if we want to achieve something like a reconstruction of what historically was, running way back in U.S.-Mexican relations, a circular flow of workers between the two countries.
Do we want that, do you think?
Now we get to politics, you see. Some people want it and some people don't. Who wants it? There are whole industries in the U.S., agriculture, construction, landscaping, areas where you really need seasonal workers. You need, if you're going to do it at a cost that people will pay, you need relatively low-cost workers, and you need them to be movable. And Mexicans have always supplied that kind of labor. They will do things that Americans will not do at the prices, at the wages that are paid. Now you could say, okay, we shouldn't be paying those low wages, and I would be happy to think about that with you, but it might be that if we had to pay wages that Americans would require to do it, whole industries would disappear. So it may well be that you can't have a citrus industry, for example, in the U.S., if you pay wages to native workers to pick the fruit. If you pay those wages, the price will be so high that you won't be able to compete with the citrus industry offshore, and so all our oranges will be grown elsewhere.
Eric, is there any effort at all made to bring the fruits of your research efforts to the candidates themselves, to the parties themselves, to the political people themselves, to the staffs in the Senate and the House that try to construct policy?
Yeah, let me duck and weave around that question. Here's the thing. The politics of immigration are very strange and make for strange bedfellows, as politics often do. So you have whole sectors of the business community that want liberalization of immigration and want to restore, if they can, this circular flow of immigration with Mexico. And they were strong supporters, really, of Bush's effort to reform immigration laws that died in the Congress last year. On the other hand, you have cultural nativists, cultural conservatives, people like Pat Buchanan, who feel that that we're sort of losing our identity as a nation if we allow a large influx of immigrants. And then, of course, you have labor, which historically has been against immigration, but recently has become more in favor of immigration. In part, I think, because labor begins to feel, with some reason, given, for example, the Justice for Janitors movement in Los Angeles, that they have a chance of organizing immigrant workers in ways that will revive the unions. So you have very complicated cross pressures on politicians. Now, we can go to politicians and we can bring our books to Congress, and we do some of that. But the kinds of things that we may be recommending, which I could get to in a minute, might be or might not be at the moment politically implausible or difficult. That doesn't mean, from our point of view, we should shut up. It means that we have to point out that if you're trying to achieve a certain end, this will be the best way to do it. When the country, if it does, get around to wanting to admit to itself that this hypocrisy that we've been sort of living through, where we pretend to harden the border, but at the same time create this demand for workers in our economy that we try to serve, that hypocrisy has got to somehow end.
It surprises me, again, a word you use, we might go to the political leaders. Don't you?
We do. And then the question is, do they pay any attention to us?
Do they?
Because they may be more worried about the political cross pressures on them. For example, hardening the border. Everybody says we've got to defend the borders, right? Everybody, I mean, across the political spectrum. Because we're taking a kind of narrow legalistic view, I think, that if workers are undocumented, then they're breaking the law, then they shouldn't be here, and no politician is really willing to say, given the failure of Bush's effort to create a path to legalization, nobody is willing to really say there should be a path to legalization unless it's a very draconian, difficult path. And no one is really talking about reestablishing this circular migration that served, I think, both countries reasonably well.
Where do we go from here?
Well, we can go by way of, we can make specific proposals. So there's a sociologist at Princeton, Alejandro Portes, who's made a very specific proposal about how you might try to reestablish circular migration. So I won't get all the details right, but it runs something like this. You have to have what amounts to an agreement between Mexico and the United States in which you try to regulate the flow of migrant workers into the United States from Mexico. And when they come at the border, they have to post a bond. And let's say the bond is about what they would be paying a coyote right now. So they pay, let's say, $3,000. And then they get a temporary work permit, which allows them to work here for 3 years, and it's renewable for another 3 years. But it's temporary. They can stay here for 6 years, but that's all. When they go back, they get their bond back, the $3,000, and they get the accumulated contributions to Social Security that they have been making during the time that they've been working here. So they're given a significant incentive to return. So that's a kind of an idea that I think is maybe politically not on the table right now, but I think would have a much better chance of serving the actual labor needs and the labor demand, which is drawing workers across the border without creating this apparently permanent group of undocumented residents.
In